Greetings, everyone, and you are watching another edition of Speak the Truth. I'm here with Elder McKinley Bolahan, and as you see on your screen, our subject matter was still in evolution. This is going to be a first program of several. We're looking at today, our video title is Piltdown Man, Willful Deception, and this is a willful. We titled it that because basically that's what Piltdown Man was. It's willful deception. Some might say, well, why are you still, this was old, this is back in the past. But as you see, when we go through this program, it's relevant because we still see the pattern that we're gonna reveal in this program. We still see this appearing from the evolution camp to
we
this
do,
to
and
this
whether
day.
the effects of these
Right.
lies are still continuing.
Exactly. Now, what we want to do, Elder Bolahan, you're going to help us. This is, again, we're focusing on Piltdown Man on today's program, willful deception. But we want to start with some history. Tell us, if you will, Elder Bolahan, a little bit about Piltdown Man, the history.
Okay, the host of Piltdown Man will begin the fossil found near Piltdown, England in 1912. And it was taken from a grave pit there. And then
Charles Dawson was the one that really presented it, wasn't it?
that is correct.
Yeah.
And when they took it from the grave pit, the Piltdown Man, then all through the encyclopedia and all these other books was created, and this was shown to be the missing link between man and ape.
Now this, and I did not bring that particular sheet because I had several entries here on how, the different institutions announced this thing as, we found the missing link, and this is evidence of ape to man transition and so forth. And that's what you're referring to, how the community just embraced this thing almost immediately and began to present it to the public as virtual fact. Is that accurate?
That is absolutely correct. There was excitement. They said that this was the missing link that they found. They boasted about in all the textbooks, and that there was proof of evolution. So this was proven evolution that they started teaching it in universities, and so it impacts the whole development of philosophy and thought of the Western world.
And this stayed in textbooks and taught in universities for how long?
Over 4 decades.
4 decades, 40 years. This
Yeah.
was in. And do you recall some of the claims that were made as to why this stayed in textbooks so long? It was some notion about it wasn't any technology there to really discover that this was a hoax until the early 50s. Is that accurate?
Well, they have a good propaganda machine because they didn't allow anyone to examine this fossil so-called found. They wouldn't allow anyone to examine it for over 40
They
years.
kept this thing on the lock and key. And
they did.
Yeah.
The lock and key. And when I think you mentioned something about a man got a print of it, and then he was
A cast.
a cast of it, and just from the cast alone, he saw the fraudulent filing, all the markings and the things that was did.
That's why and I'm going to read some excerpts from some articles and some research that was done. But you're exactly right. Matter of fact, let me see if I can pull that up.
Okay, they say that it was an ape man, and they said that the person, they say that it was a ape jawbone, and they had the head of a man on it, and they had broke it off, and then they had color it with. They had
some kind of dye they used.
Carbon, I think, a bicarbon something that they used. They made it look old.
Right.
And even when they drilled into the bones, where you would get fossils, bone dust from fossils, they found flesh.
I'm going to read a few excerpts here. This particular excerpt is from an article called People and Discoveries. I think that's the publication. The title of the article is called Piltdown Man is Revealed as Fake. This appeared apparently on public television, on the public television website. But there's an excerpt here that reads like this. It says, in 1953, Joseph Weiner, an Oxford professor of physical anthropology, met Kenneth Oakley at a banquet. They got chatting about the Piltdown puzzle, and Weiner couldn't get it out of his mind. He had reports on the research and casts of the fossils and began examining each minutely. He was amazed to see that the fossil teeth seemed to have been deliberately ground down with something abrasive to give them a unique wear pattern. He called Oakley, who had access to the real fossils, and asked him to look at them with a magnifier. He too became convinced the teeth had been purposely changed to fit the Piltdown Man. Now, he too, both Oakley and Weiner, became convinced. And how were they convinced? Not by a fluoride test. They were convinced by simple, visible.
Just by examining, because like you say, the artificial coloring, it's a solution called bicarbonate that they use to stain this particular. They had canine tooth. They had even had a elephant bone associated with the skull that came out of Egypt. So this thing was a compilation of all these different, and even when they so-called dated this whole skeleton, they found different dates as it pertained to that fossil. So the whole thing was just falling all apart, and no wonder they hid it for 40 years, because the only way you could keep that lie alive is to hide it.
And this is what makes this clear. And I'm going to read some other excerpts of scientists that knew it was a forgery from the very outset. Even in 1912, they felt and knew that it was a forgery. But I want to highlight what we just read, how these individuals, just through visible observation, clearly acknowledged their being 100% convinced, certain that this was fraudulent. So that means that it did not take. That it goes on to say this. It says Weiner and Oakley now undertook new chemical analysis, including an improved fluorine test, and found that the jaw and teeth were not the same age as the skull and were not even fossils, just old bones. And my point is that if I know this is an embarrassment, or was an embarrassment, and probably it still should be, to the evolution camp, and they tried to marginalize this to say, well, this was such a brilliant hoax that, it took advanced testing methods that only appeared in 1953 to really conclusively expose this to be fraudulent. But the reality is, just on physical examination, the scientists and really everyone that came out against this hoax from the very beginning came out against it just by virtue of what it looked like. You could tell it was fraudulent. It had file marks on the
teeth.
And so clearly it did not require some advanced testing method to prove that this was a hoax. Well, no, you could see it from the beginning. And even if there was something that the fluoride testing fully substantiated, scientists never should have presented this to the public as absolute fact with all of these red flags that other scientists, and we're going to read some of the other scientists that spoke out against this from the very outset, were saying. They thrust this into the public and put it in textbooks, put it in encyclopedias for over 4 decades, when all of these red flags existed from the very beginning.
Well, not only the red flags, but to hide what you say is a bona fide discovery And then, so you must need to hide it for some reason. So even the people who have put this fraud together knew that this was flaky. Now, when we're talking about this, they even put a positive spin on this and say what Joseph just said, that we found this out ourselves, and but that's not even factual. But anyway, to say that we corrected this and scientists benefit from this lie, and millions of people, the babies was aborted and everything else because of these concepts, the survival of the fittest and all this stuff. Now, we have major problems even today from this. So to say that they have some beneficial effects because of what they did would be a bald-faced lie.
Well, here's another, it's this article called, let's see what we got here. It's an article called Piltdown Man and the Dualist Contention from Scientific American is the publication. And
the dualist contention, what do that mean?
Let's see here. Why were the dualists ignored? It says the dualist argument were there right throughout the sorry history of one of paleontologists' greatest and most notorious hoax, yet were ignored or waved away by several prominent workers who held influential positions. Piltdown's prominence, like Pycraft, used the weight of authority and special access to the material to dismiss or squash the dualist argument. This is despite the fact that those who made the dualist argument were actually more qualified, more experienced, and more relevant as goes the qualifications and the areas of expertise when compared to the proponents. It goes on. Dualist is discussed at length in all the good books on Piltdown, and also form the focus of one of Stephen Gould's essays. I would say the same as Gould and other commentators.
Okay.
If leading workers in England, the USA, and elsewhere had not been so invested, so committed in the supposed authenticity of Piltdown Man, if only they had listened to their detractors, to Miller and others, they might well have accepted and understood the very reasonable, very well-supported argument of the dualists. Alarm bells were ringing right from the start.
They were ringing, but they weren't willing to hear it because of the racist concepts that life began in England, in Europe. So this whole thing was supporting that whole concept. So they wouldn't, all the scientists that was embarrassed by this, but they were so easily persuaded that life had its beginning on the English continent, instead of on all the evidence that ever supported genetic information, DNA information, historical information, documentation of writings, civilizations, all that came from the African continent. So now they came up with this theory that life began in England. And they was willing to buy into that because it fits that whole concept of white supremacy.
Well, it's called what's the word? Confirmation bias, where you ignore all the actual evidence because you already have a preconceived, idea or belief or understanding of what you want the facts to say.
Well, so the old folks say that don't bother telling me no facts because I done made up my mind
already. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Here's another. Let's see what this says. What makes the Piltdown Man situation so unnerving is that it was an intentional and fabricated hoax. This wasn't a hypothesis that was proved incorrect and that some in the scientific community were still clinging to. This was an outright lie.
So generations was indoctrinated with this outright lie to sell the concept of evolution.
Yeah, and you was going to talk about that impact. You had how sending this false message, because it wasn't true, that okay, we've proven that there's a link from ape to man. So now all of these belief systems that's built on survival of the fittest. But we talking about Hitler's philosophy and the master race and survival of the fittest, and you know, we're nothing but basically animals.
But that is right, because Dr. Frederick Schaefer and Dr. Morris point out that the theory of evolution, with its idea of survival of the fittest, was one of the viewpoints behind fascism, communism. Darwin ideas induced Hitler to attempt to exterminate the Jews in World War II.
And why not kill? Because they're nothing but animals, and survival as animals, absolutely, that's what we do. We kill the weak, right, and we preserve the strong.
That's right. Now they go on to say that the philosophy of the communists that's slaughtered millions, also in Cambodia. Also they talk about the enslavement of African people and the destruction on African, and the mass murders that's in Africa and China, the Vietnam War. They talk about this is the survival of the fittest philosophy run amok. They even point out on abortions, over 2 million babies was killed in America due to the eugenics movement and the Planned Parenthood concept. All of that came out of this evolution, which is mindless, no right, purpose for life at all.
No purpose for life. We're all animals. So what's the real value? We're no different from the apes in the fields and hanging in the trees. So why do we value human life if we're all apes and animals? And so why not abort if that would better my position to bring another child? Just kill it. So
well, there's a selfishness.
Right.
When you don't have compassion for human life, or you don't value human life, you don't see value. You look at might make right. The ethics and the morality don't enter the picture because there is no ethic and morality in this philosophy.
And that's the detriment to this an individual. Why are you harping on? Because, again, there's a pattern here that we yet see coming out of this. I mean, there are many hoaxes that we're going to address in the future, but there's a pattern that we consistently see. You would think, okay, some claim we learned the lesson, we moved on. No, you haven't learned the lesson, obviously, because we're going to deal with Archaeopteryx. We're going to deal with Piltdown chicken, who was also a lie that I think was as recent as 1999, if I'm not mistaken. We're going to get into that. So the thing of it is, to say, why y'all keep bringing this up, and why you keep, we learned our lesson and we policed ourselves and we're moving on. Well, apparently you're actually not moving on, because this is just one of many of this type of willful deception that has been perpetrated on the public, that known lies, stuff that should have been seen from the very outset, but because, as you say, Elder Bonehan, they kept the evidence, they kept the fossil under lock and key. Wouldn't let anybody have access, certainly anyone that they knew would be a dissenter. And it wasn't until 1953, and then even Weiner, if I got his name correct, he saw it was a hoax just looking at a cast, not even the real fossil, and knew something was wrong.
Well, if the evolutionists is saying that they have found religion and been converted, and they're going to stop telling lies, we might convene them. But since they don't believe in religion, so they ain't been converted, so they're still lying.
Well, and that was the point, that, when you take, because usually evolution go hand in hand with atheism.
Absolutely.
And so that survival of the fittest, there's no compassion for life, there's no compassion for human beings, and we're just animals, and you start that domino effect. When you take the value off of life, then you're setting society up to just bitterness, lack of caring, and that just blooms into all sorts of other, no morals, no values. We can lie and continue to lie, and it does not have any, doesn't touch our consciousness at all.
Well, no, because they haven't changed, and that's why I say the only way they're going to change is be converted, and they ain't going to be converted because they don't believe. But this is religion, because any time that you don't have evidence and you don't have scientific facts, They have
It's
faith
faith.
in what they are teaching.
Right. Well, I'm gonna close with this statement. It's regarding true science. This is true science. It says true science, which is not the slave of collegiate bureaucracies or scientific institutes sustained by tax dollars and grant foundations, cannot have this sort of bigotry against evidence which conflicts with a popular theory. In other words, when the evidence speaks against, no matter how popular a theory is, if the evidence speaks otherwise, good science goes with the evidence, not popular theory.
That's absolutely right.
Well, we're going to close this out at this time, and but this is just one. We're going to come back with our icon list of evolution, but we hope this will be informative and a blessing to you. God bless.
Peace.